People like you don't own property here." Jett Warwick's voice cut across the noon sun like a blade, his leather vest dark with road grime as he leaned against the fence post on Isla Carmody's land. One boot crushing her grandfather's wildflowers, 12 bikes idling behind him like a threat with an engine. He held out a folded check without looking at her, the way you'd toss table scraps. "Sign the deed over, take the money, and we'll forget we ever saw you out here." Isla stood on the porch steps in her olive green blouse and dark jeans, arms loose at her sides, a coffee mug still warm in her hand, her eyes moving slowly across each face in that line of men, memorizing them, not fearing them. She didn't take the check. She took a slow sip instead. And not one of those 12 men had any idea that she had been waiting 3 years for this exact moment, or that every word Jett just said was being recorded by 4 federal-grade devices buried in the fence posts around them. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The noon sun over Harlow County did not forgive anything. It came down hard and white and total, burning off every shadow, flooding the open property in the kind of relentless daylight that made the truth of things impossible to hide. The wild flowers along the fence line, purple clover and yellow coreopsis that Gerald Carmody had planted with his own hands 40 years back, shivered slightly in the dry summer heat. They were the only things on the property that seemed to tremble. Isla Carmody was not trembling. She stood on the second porch step with the posture of a woman who had chosen exactly where to stand. Not too close to the men, not backed against the door. Right there, in the full overhead sun, visible and unhurried, her olive green blouse catching the light, her dark jeans pressed, her feet planted. She held the coffee mug in her right hand because her right hand needed something ordinary to hold. It was a discipline she had learned over 12 years in the field. When everything in you sharpens into surveillance mode, you give your hands something civilian to do. Jett Warwick was still holding the check out, arm extended at an angle that suggested he was not accustomed to waiting. He was a tall man, wide through the chest, with a jaw built for setting hard and eyes that moved the way a landlord's eyes moved, over property, not people. His leather vest carried the Iron Crest patch on the back, the same emblem Isla had been photographing in evidence folders for 31 months. His jeans were dark, his boots were heavy. One of them was still resting on the base of the fence post, and beneath that boot, barely visible in the tall grass, a cluster of her grandfather's wildflowers was being slowly, casually crushed. Isla noted that too. She noted everything. Her eyes moved in a systematic sweep that anyone watching might have mistaken for nervous uncertainty. They would have been wrong. Left to right, face to face, she catalogued each of the 12 men along that fence line the way an investigator catalogues a scene, not emotionally, but precisely. She had photographs of 9 of them already. The 3 she didn't recognize were new. She filed their faces like documents. The smell hit her first, whenever she allowed her senses any latitude. Engine exhaust layered thick over the sweetness of wildflower pollen, the sharp edge of hot asphalt carried in on the bikes, and underneath it all, the particular dry smell of her grandfather's land in July, the smell of old soil that had been worked and loved and refused to yield. She had grown up in this smell. She had driven 6 hours back to it 3 days ago and stood on this porch in the dark and let it settle over her like something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She was not going to let these men take it. Jett Warwick's jaw tightened. The check was still in the air. He was recalibrating. Men like Jett Warwick had a predictable internal timeline. They expected the offer to create immediate deference, and when it didn't, a very specific expression crossed their faces, a hardening around the eyes, a slight forward tilt, the body language of a man reassessing whether pleasantries were necessary at all. Isla recognized that sequence. She had cataloged that too. She took a slow sip of coffee. The sound of 12 idling engines was a kind of low, persistent pressure designed to feel like proximity even at a distance, designed to make the person on the other side of the negotiation feel surrounded. Isla had been in rooms with men who carried loaded weapons on their persons and federal warrants for their arrest already filed, and she had held conversations in those rooms without her pulse breaking 60 beats per minute. 12 bikes and a folded check were not going to rewrite her nervous system today. Jett let the check drop slightly, not putting it away, just lowering it to signal a shift in tone. His voice came out level and almost reasonable, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. He told her the land had prior obligations, that there were arrangements in place she might not be aware of, old agreements tied to the title that would need to be resolved one way or another. He said the word arrangements the way people said the word arrangements when they meant something they had manufactured and intended to use against you. Isla let him finish. Then she asked one question. She asked it quietly, the way you ask a question when you already know the answer and you want the other person to not know that you know. She asked, who drew up those obligations? The silence that followed was brief, a fraction of a second, maybe less. But Isla had spent 12 years learning to read fractions of a second, and what she read in that sliver of time was everything. Jett Warwick's jaw moved slightly before his mouth did. His eyes pulled left, just briefly, the involuntary direction of a man reaching for a prepared answer instead of a true one. It was the tiniest crack in the construction of him, and it was the first crack she had observed in person, and it was exactly what she had needed to see. He recovered quickly. She gave him credit for that. He straightened, looked at her directly for the first time, and told her they would be back. He told her that Harlow County had a long memory for people who made things complicated, and that she ought to spend the rest of the afternoon thinking seriously about her situation. He folded the check and put it in his vest pocket. He pushed off the fence post with one shoulder and walked back toward his bike without hurrying. The engines revved in sequence as the 12 bikes turned in the gravel driveway, exhaust rolling back across the property in a hot gray wave. And then they were on the road, the sound dropping in pitch as they pulled away. And then they were just a sound. And then they were nothing. Isla stood on the porch step. She stood there for 10 full seconds after the last engine sound faded, her coffee mug still in her hand, the July sun still coming down in hard white sheets over the property, the wild flowers along the fence line still stirring in the residual draft of 12 departing machines. Then she moved. She stepped off the porch without rushing, walked across the dry grass toward the fence line at an ordinary pace, and stopped at the nearest post. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the wood, just for a moment. It was a gesture that, from a distance, might have looked like grief. A woman touching her grandfather's fence post, feeling the permanence of what he had built. That was not what it was. Beneath her palm, recessed into a drilled cavity in the wood, and sealed with weather resin matched to the grain, a federal-grade audio recording device no larger than a thumb drive had captured every syllable spoken within 40 feet of that post for the past 72 hours. Isla had placed all 4 of them herself on the night she arrived, before she unpacked a single bag, before she made a single cup of coffee. She had placed them in the dark with a pen light and a drill she'd carried in her luggage, because she had known with the certainty of someone who had built a case file 3 inches thick, that this moment was coming. She moved to the second post. Same gesture, same palm-flat contact, same quiet confirmation. The second device was intact. She checked the third post along the property's north edge, and the fourth along the south corner, walking the fence line in the full overhead sunlight, her expression calm, her pace unhurried. a woman who looked like she was simply taking stock of her inheritance. When she reached the last post, she let her hand rest on the wood one beat longer than the others. Then she allowed herself the smile. It was not a wide smile. It was the specific, small, controlled expression of someone who has spent 3 years being patient and has just watched patience begin to pay. It came up slowly and settled into the corners of her mouth and stayed there while she looked out at the road where 12 bikes had just pulled away, carrying with them 12 men who believed they had delivered a message. They had, just not the one they intended. Isla Carmody turned back toward the farmhouse, her olive green blouse bright in the noon light, her dark jeans moving through the tall grass along the fence line, the wild flowers her grandfather planted swaying gently behind her. She climbed the porch steps, set her coffee mug down on the railing, and looked out across Gerald Carmody's land, every acre of it under full, unforgiving sun, every fence post in place, every word recorded. Jett Warwick had come today believing this was the beginning of a problem. He had no idea it was the beginning of the end. She was up before the sun finished deciding whether to rise. Isla Carmody stood on the back porch of her grandfather's farmhouse in an olive green blouse and dark jeans, boots already laced, coffee already finished, the empty mug sitting on the wooden railing where Gerald Carmody used to rest his Bible on Sunday mornings. The sky over Harlow County was doing what early sky does in late spring, bleeding the night out slowly, pushing pink into the gray, letting the trees come back into shape one outline at a time. She watched it for exactly as long as she allowed herself. Then she stepped off the porch and began to walk. The property ran 11 acres in a rough rectangle, bounded on the east by a tree line of old-growth oak, on the west by a gravel county road that had no name on any official map, on the north by Nadine Carmody's fence, and on the south by a creek that had been running since before any deed in Harlow County was signed in anyone's name. Isla walked the perimeter the way she used to run surveillance routes, measured, eyes moving in a consistent pattern, brain cataloging and filing. The difference was that this morning she was not looking for threats. She was looking for him. Gerald Carmody had been everywhere on this land. You could feel it if you knew how to feel for it. The fence posts along the eastern tree line were his work, hand set in 1974, still plumb, still solid, because Gerald Carmody had believed that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing so well that your granddaughter could lean on it 40 years later. The south pasture still had the low stone border he had laid one summer, stone by stone, along the creek bank, to keep the soil from washing when the creek ran high. His hands had touched every corner of this place. His decisions were written in the grade of every ditch and the placement of every gate. Isla Carmody walked through all of it with her hands in her pockets and her eyes open, and she let herself feel it, which she almost never did, because feeling things when you were running an operation was a liability she could not afford. And today she was allowing herself one morning before the armor went back on. She was 7 years old the first time she walked this perimeter. Gerald Carmody had been at her side, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who understood that ownership was not about paperwork. It was about presence, about knowing every low spot where water collected and every high point where you could see 3 fields at once. He had told her that morning. She could still hear the exact register of his voice, that this land had not been given to them. It had been taken from the world one legal obstacle at a time. In 1961, when a black man acquiring rural property in a county like Harlow was not a transaction the institutional machinery of that county was designed to facilitate. Banks had declined him. Title offices had lost his applications. A previous seller had backed out twice before Gerald Carmody finally found a path through, and the path had cost him everything he had saved in 11 years of working 2 jobs. He bought it anyway. He put his hands on the first fence post, and he stayed. Isla Carmody stopped at the northeast corner, where a cluster of wild clover had taken over a section of fence line, and she let herself remember the other visit. Not the childhood visits. The last one, 3 years ago. She had driven up on a Friday evening after closing a federal wire fraud case in Memphis, planning to spend one weekend eating her grandfather's cooking and sleeping in a real bed. She had seen the tire tracks first, wide, heavy, pressed deep into the soft grass near the driveway, the kind of tracks that motorcycle tires made when several of them turned at the same time. She had seen the mailbox next, the post leaning at an angle that was not weather damage. And then she had seen her grandfather. Gerald Carmody had been sitting at the kitchen table under the overhead fluorescent light with his hands flat on the surface, and he had looked up at her when she came in and smiled the specific smile of a man who had decided to protect someone from something by pretending it did not exist. He was 81 years old. His hands were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age. She had sat across from him and asked him directly, the way the FBI had trained her to ask, and the way she had learned from him long before that. And he had said it was nothing, just some local boys with too much time. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed to themselves until they almost believe it. She had not pushed. She had sat with him and eaten dinner and watched him not sleep from the light under his bedroom door. And by Saturday morning she had walked the property and seen everything she needed to see. The spray of gravel at the south end of the driveway, where someone had accelerated away fast. The section of creek bank stonework knocked loose in a pattern that was not natural erosion. The faint scorch mark on the corner of the equipment shed that someone had tried to wash off. She cataloged it all in silence and drove back to Memphis on Sunday and handed in her early retirement paperwork on Monday morning. Gerald Carmody died 14 months later, still in probate court, still defending the title to land that was his beyond any legal argument, exhausted by a fight that should never have existed. He died with the case unresolved, and the Iron Crest gang still riding through Harlow County with the easy confidence of men who had never faced a consequence. Isla Carmody had sat in the front pew at his funeral in her black dress and held her grief in both hands like something she was keeping safe until she could use it properly. Then she had gone back to school, federal land rights law, accelerated program, bar exam in 18 months. She had passed on the first attempt. She reached the north fence line, and Nadine Carmody was already there, 72 years old. In her blue jacket over a cream blouse, carrying a cloth-covered dish with the authority of a woman who fed people as a form of testimony, Nadine Carmody had crossed from her property and was standing at the fence gate with an expression that said she had been up since before Isla had. Her face carried the kind of deep-mapped dignity that comes from watching a great deal of history happen to people you loved. Isla opened the gate, and they walked back to the farmhouse together, and over the kitchen table, under the overhead fluorescent light, while Nadine uncovered a pan of sweet potato cornbread and poured them both coffee without asking. She began to talk, not quickly, in the layered rural cadence that was its own kind of language, the language of people who had learned to say the most important things sideways, because saying them directly had sometimes brought men to your door. She told Isla about the Pruitt family first. 40 acres on the county's western edge, 4 generations of title, lost in a 2-year campaign of what the county had officially recorded as financial hardship, but which Nadine Carmody described with quiet precision, the dead livestock that no veterinarian could explain, the loan applications that were denied after Iron Crest members were seen visiting the bank manager socially, the night visits that left Marcus Pruitt's oldest son unable to sleep in his own house. The land was now registered to a holding company that Nadine had no name for, but that Isla already knew by 3 different corporate aliases. She told Isla about the Dade family's son, Jerome Dade, 26 years old, who had inherited his father's property and lasted 4 months before 2 men in Iron Crest colors beat him badly enough to require hospitalization and left a note on the door of his hospital room that the county sheriff's office had officially described as a prank. Jerome Dade had signed his deed transfer from his hospital bed and moved to Atlanta. He had not come back. She told Isla about the Holloways last, and the way she told it was the quietest, which meant it was the worst. The Holloways had simply been there and then not been there. A family of 5. One season they were farming the south end of their property, and the next season the house was empty, and no one in Harlow County claimed to know where they had gone, and the title had transferred through a probate process that Nadine Carmody said had moved through the county courthouse in under 3 weeks, which she said with the inflection of a woman who had lived long enough to know that paperwork that moved fast in Harlow County was paperwork that had been helped to move fast. Each story landed in Isla Carmody's chest and settled there alongside the ones already living in her. She said very little while Nadine talked. She did not need to. She was not hearing any of this for the first time. She was hearing it in the voice of someone who had lived inside it. And that was different from reading it in a federal file. And it mattered. After Nadine went home, Isla Carmody stood in the back bedroom for a moment, looking at the photograph of Gerald Carmody on the dresser, a younger man, mid-40s, standing in the south pasture with his hands at his sides and an expression of uncomplicated ownership on his face. She touched the frame. Then she moved to the closet, pushed the hanging clothes aside, and pressed down on the 3rd floorboard from the left. The panel released cleanly. Below it, fitted into a waterproof housing she had installed herself 14 months ago, was the operation. Maps of Harlow County, with properties marked in 3 colors: lost, pressured, and pending. Photographs of Iron Crest members at county offices, at banks, at deed recordings, financial records showing the shell company trail behind 6 land transfers, land deed fraud documents, each one annotated in Isla Carmody's precise handwriting, federal wiretap authorizations, signed and sealed, covering 4 jurisdictions, a case file 3 years deep, built from the tire tracks on a lawn and a grandfather's trembling hands. And one weekend when everything changed, she looked at it for a long moment. Not with relief, with recognition, the way you look at a thing you have been building in the dark and finally bring into the light. She picked up her phone and called Simone Ibarra. It rang once. "He came," Isla said, her voice level and certain. The voice of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for exactly 3 years. It started. She saw it the moment she turned off the county road. The truck listed hard to the right, both passenger side tires flat against the gravel, and even from 50 yards out, Isla Carmody could see the rear driver's side, sitting just as low. She eased her rental car to a stop in the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for exactly 4 seconds before she reached for her phone. Not because she needed the moment, because she wanted to give herself one. Then she got out. The morning sun sat high and direct over the Carmody property, flooding every surface in hard natural light. No shadows generous enough to hide anything, no corners dim enough for doubt. She walked toward the truck slowly, the gravel clicking under her boots, and cataloged what she saw with the same detached precision she had used for 12 years on federal crime scenes. All 4 tires, not 2, not 3, every single one, slashed with something thin and deliberate, a blade drawn in a single long stroke along each sidewall. Not rage, method. Whoever did this had time and intention. She walked past the truck without touching it. The barn door was worse. The letters were 2 feet tall, spray painted in red that had dripped slightly at the bottom of each stroke. Last chance, pressed across the weathered gray wood, like something screaming, like something that believed it had the right to scream. She stood in front of it for a long moment in her orange top and dark jeans, her eyes moving from the first letter to the last, reading it the way you read a document you were expecting. She had been expecting it. She pulled out her phone and began photographing. She shot the barn door from 6 angles. She shot the tires in sequence, close enough to capture the clean geometry of each cut. She shot the driveway for track patterns, the fence line for footprints, the perimeter fence post nearest the barn because she wanted a record of what was near it. She uploaded everything to the secure federal server through an encrypted connection before she dialed the non-emergency line for the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. Her voice, when the dispatcher answered, was the voice of a woman reporting a minor inconvenience. Deputy Cole Maddox arrived 22 minutes later. He was young, late 20s at the outside, with close-cut sandy hair and a short-sleeve uniform that showed a farmer's tan at the forearm. He climbed out of the cruiser and looked at the barn door and looked at the truck, and his face did the thing that faces do when they have already composed themselves before arriving. He had his notepad out before he reached her. "Miss Carmody," he said. "Professional, careful." "Deputy Maddox." She watched his eyes track to the spray paint and then away. "I appreciate you coming out." He nodded and moved toward the truck with the posture of a man performing competence, crouching near the rear tire and examining the sidewall without touching it. He was not incompetent, she noted. That was the specific tragedy of Cole Maddox. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew who had done it. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, that particular tension that lives between knowledge and silence, when silence has been chosen enough times to become a habit. She had a file on him, not because he was a villain, because he was something more dangerous to justice than a villain. He was a good man who had learned to look away. 3 complaints in 18 months, all involving Iron Crest. A Pruitt family report about fence line harassment, suppressed at intake. A complaint from Dade family property about threatening riders, referred to Sheriff Stills and closed without investigation. A noise complaint from the Holloway parcel that Cole Maddox himself had been first on scene for, where he had spoken to Rafe Dunmore personally and left without filing a single line of documentation. 3 times. 18 months. The math was precise. She let him write in his notepad for a while. She answered his questions without editorializing: what time she left, what time she returned, whether she had seen any vehicles near the property. Then she asked her own, "You have any open complaints involving property damage in this area? Any patterns I should know about?" His pen slowed by a fraction. "That'd be something to take up with Sheriff Stills. He handles the broader operational picture." "Has Sheriff Stills seen much of this type of thing in Harlow County?" "Miss Carmody." He looked up, and his eyes were not unkind. They were just finished. "I'm going to file this report, and it will go to the sheriff's review. That's the process." "Of course," she said. "Thank you, Deputy." She watched him drive away and said nothing else. She went inside and made coffee. Jett Warwick came back at 2 in the afternoon. There was no convoy this time. No 12 bikes and no theater. Just 2 motorcycles rolling up the driveway. Jett Warwick in front, and behind him, a man she had identified from surveillance photographs as Rafe Dunmore. Broad through the chest, with a jaw that looked like it had been involved in every bad decision he had ever made. He wore a black t-shirt and dark jeans, and he moved off his bike with the coiled, proprietary energy of a man who had never encountered a space he didn't immediately begin to measure for weaknesses. Jett Warwick walked directly to the barn door. He crouched in front of it, leather vest straining at his shoulders, and studied the red paint with the satisfied expression of a man reviewing his own work. Then he looked up at Isla Carmody, where she stood on the porch steps in her orange top and dark jeans, coffee mug in hand. "Somebody's got opinions," he said. "Apparently," she said, "this county has a way of making things official." He stood slowly and brushed dust from his knee with an unhurried hand. "When there's a property situation that needs resolving, official channels, deed office, county records." He let that sit. "I've got people there." Behind him, Rafe Dunmore had begun a slow circuit of the property, not walking the fence line, but walking just inside it, Pausing at the barn, looking at the outbuildings, she tracked him with her peripheral vision without turning her head. She took a sip of coffee and let a beat of silence pass. Then she tilted her head slightly. I've been going through my grandfather's old records, trying to understand the history of this land. It's hard when you don't know the full picture. She paused. Did you know the families that farmed out this way? The Pruitts, the Holloways. I found some of their old fence markers on the north edge. I was curious what happened to them. Something shifted in Jett Warwick's expression. She saw it clearly. The calibration of a man deciding whether a question was a threat or an invitation. Her tone had been soft, genuinely curious, the voice of a woman in over her head. He decided it was an invitation. Pruitts couldn't manage what they had, he said. He almost sounded sorry about it. Land like that needs somebody who understands how the county works. They didn't. Things got complicated with their title and they moved on. Holloways, same situation. He looked at her steadily. The county has certain obligations on properties when ownership isn't clear. I've been involved in helping sort a few of those situations. I know how the process goes. That must have been difficult for those families, she said. Change is difficult for everybody, he said. Rafe Dunmore had come back around to the far side of the truck and was looking at the slashed tires with no expression at all. Jett Warwick glanced at him, then back at Isla Carmody. You should think seriously about what you want your situation here to be, he said. Because the deed office process, once it starts, it moves fast, and it is not reversible. I appreciate the information, she said. I genuinely do. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. She did not blink first. He finally looked away, not dramatically, just the natural movement of a man already thinking about the next thing, and walked back to his bike. Rafe Dunmore followed without speaking. The two motorcycles pulled out of the driveway and left a thin haze of exhaust hanging in the afternoon sun. Isla Carmody stood on the porch steps until the sound of the engines dissolved completely into the county road. Then she set her coffee mug down on the railing, walked off the porch, and directly to the fence post nearest the barn door, the second post from the southwest corner, and pressed 2 fingers briefly against the wood just below the top rail. The device was still warm from the afternoon sun. She moved to the next post without pausing. All 4, intact, recording. Inside the farmhouse, under the bright overhead lights of the kitchen, she pulled up the secure transmission interface on her laptop and connected the audio relay. She listened to 4 minutes and 37 seconds of the afternoon's recording. Jett Warwick's voice came through clean and unhurried. The Pruitts couldn't manage what they had. The Holloways, same situation. She had been involved in helping sort a few of those situations. The county has certain obligations on properties when ownership isn't clear. 2 families named. 2 prior incidents directly connected to his involvement. Statements about the deed office, about his contacts there, about the irreversibility of the process he described. She had asked questions that sounded like confusion and received answers that sounded like confession. She tagged the timestamps, annotated each relevant statement with its corresponding charge category: land fraud conspiracy, coercion, conspiracy to deprive of civil rights, and composed a transmission summary with the precision of someone who had written several hundred federal case annotations in her career. She hit send at 8:47 p.m. Her phone rang at 8:49 p.m. Agent Simona Barra's voice came through measured and alert. I'm looking at it. 2 more counts, Isla Carmody said. Conspiracy to commit federal land fraud. In his own voice, a brief silence. He named the Pruitts directly, named them and placed himself at the resolution of their title situation. Same for the Holloways. She looked out the kitchen window at the dark outline of the barn against the night sky, the red paint invisible in the darkness, but no less present. He's comfortable, Simone. He thinks this is already decided. Let him think that, Agent Simona Barra said. I intend to, said Isla Carmody. She closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to the back bedroom. She did not look out the window again. The fence post stood in the darkness along the property line, silent and patient, holding everything she needed. The land was doing exactly what she asked of it. It was remembering. The notice arrived at 9:17 in the morning. Isla Carmody was standing on the porch with her second cup of coffee when Deputy Cole Maddox's cruiser rolled up the gravel drive, kicking pale dust into the bright morning air. The sky above Harlow County was the kind of deep, unclouded blue that made everything below it look more vivid than it deserved. The green of the grass, the red of the barn, the white of the fence posts where 4 federal recording devices sat embedded and waiting. Cole Maddox stepped out of the cruiser in his short-sleeve uniform, his hat already slightly crooked, his eyes doing the thing they always did around Isla Carmody, moving to the left, to the ground, anywhere but straight at her face. She walked down the porch steps to meet him. He held out a manila envelope with the Harlow County Sheriff's Office seal pressed across the flap, and he said what he had been rehearsed to say. "Ms. Carmody, I've been asked to deliver a formal notice. A title dispute hearing has been filed in county court regarding this property. You are named as respondent. The filing was made by 3 claimants." He paused. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Isla Carmody took the envelope without expression. She turned it once in her hands, feeling the weight of it the way a doctor feels the edge of an X-ray, not reading it yet, just understanding its shape. "Who filed it, Deputy?" Cole Maddox looked at his boots. "The filing comes through the county clerk's office. I'm just delivering the notice, ma'am." "I know what you're doing," she said. Her voice carried no heat. It was simply factual, the way a weather report is factual. She let the sentence settle between them for exactly long enough to mean something, and then she said, "Thank you for coming out." He got back into his cruiser faster than a man with nothing to hide would have needed to. Isla Carmody stood in the morning sun and opened the envelope. She read the filing standing right there in the driveway, her coffee cooling in her other hand. The document claimed that the Carmody property sat on land with contested title history dating back to a 1987 transfer that had, according to the filing, never been properly recorded. It claimed that Isla Carmody had been observed trespassing on parcels adjacent to her own boundary. It claimed, and this was the part that almost made her smile, that she had made threatening statements to 2 members of the Iron Crest motorcycle club during a lawful visit to the property. Lawful visit. She folded the document, walked back inside the farmhouse, and set it on the kitchen table next to her coffee mug. Then she went to the back bedroom closet, pressed her thumb to the recessed panel near the baseboard, and lifted the false floor. She did not need to look long. The document she was looking for was in a red folder marked Title Chain, Carmody G., and it was exactly where she had placed it 14 months ago, before she ever set foot in Harlow County as anything other than a granddaughter with a grief that had no name yet. She laid the red folder open on the kitchen table beside the fraudulent filing. The comprehensive federal land title history for the property ran to 41 pages. It had been certified by 3 independent title companies in 2 separate states. It had been authenticated by the United States Land Rights Division under the authority of the Department of Justice. It traced every recorded transaction, every deed transfer, every boundary survey, every tax payment on this land going back to 1961, when Gerald Carmody had put down money that took him 11 years to save and signed his name on soil that the county had not expected a black man to hold for long. Every claim in the fraudulent filing evaporated against those 41 pages, the way fog burns off a field when the sun gets serious. She photographed the fraudulent filing, uploaded it to the secure federal server, and made a note in her case log. Exhibit 30. She made herself a 3rd cup of coffee. At 2:45 that afternoon, the barn caught fire. Isla Carmody was at the fence line on the east side of the property when she smelled it. Not wood smoke from a fireplace, not the clean burn of brush, but something hotter and more specific, the smell of old timber accelerating past the point of no return. She turned and saw the orange already pushing through the barn's upper loft window, the smoke beginning to column upward into the wide blue afternoon sky with the unhurried confidence of something that had been given a head start. She stood at the fence line and watched it go. She did not run. She did not scream. She pulled her phone from her jeans pocket and called the fire department, and then she stood there with her orange top and dark jeans and her arms at her sides, and she watched the barn that her grandfather Gerald Carmody had built with his own hands in the summer of 1964 begin to come apart in the heat. Her face was a controlled surface, still water over everything churning below it. She photographed the fire from 6 angles before the fire department arrived, cataloging the point of origin at the barn's northwest corner. Not an accident, not an electrical fault, an origin point that sat exactly where an accelerant would be poured by someone who had circled the property 2 days ago with the slow curiosity of a man looking for weaknesses. The fire department arrived at 3:22, 37 minutes after her call. The nearest station was 8 minutes away. She knew because she had driven the route herself on her second day back in Harlow County. She said nothing about the 37 minutes. She photographed the fire trucks in the driveway and added the timestamp to the federal file. By 4 o'clock, the barn was a black skeleton standing against the afternoon light, its bones still smoking, its interior collapsed into a heap of ash that had once been a hand plane and a level and a set of wooden-handled chisels that Gerald Carmody had kept oiled and hanging on the east wall because he believed that tools deserved to be cared for. He had told Isla that once when she was 9 years old, and she had not understood it then the way she understood it now. Standing at the edge of what remained, the fire captain told her they would file an incident report. She thanked him with a voice that gave him nothing. When the last truck left and the gravel drive went quiet and the smoke thinned to a gray drift against the early evening sky, Isla Carmody walked back into the farmhouse alone and stood in the kitchen under the overhead fluorescent light, and for exactly 1 minute she allowed herself to fall apart. Not a performance, not a tactic. A minute of truth in a kitchen that smelled like old wood and her grandfather's ghost. She pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table, and she breathed, and she let the grief come the way you let a wave come when you are too tired to outrun it. Her grandfather's barn, her grandfather's tools, her grandfather's hands that had built that structure out of stubbornness and faith and a refusal to believe that the land could be taken from him twice. He had fought the county in probate court at 78 years old. He had driven himself to hearings with arthritic hands and worn his good jacket and spoken clearly into the record. He had done everything right and still been made to feel like an intruder on his own soil. And now the people who had tormented the final years of his life had taken the last standing thing he had built and burned it into nothing, and the fire department had taken 37 minutes to arrive because in Harlow County the calculus of response time changed depending on whose property was burning. 60 seconds. Then Isla Carmody lifted her hands from the table, straightened her back, and picked up her phone. Elias Rentham answered on the second ring. He was a careful man, her U.S. attorney contact, a man who measured his sentences and rarely used words he did not need. She had worked with him on 2 prior federal operations, and she trusted his precision the way she trusted a good compass, not because it was warm, but because it was accurate. They burned the barn, she said. Today. 2:45. Point of origin at the northwest corner. Accelerant pattern. Fire department response was 37 minutes from a station 8 minutes out. She paused and let him process that. The same morning they filed fraudulent title complaints through the county clerk using Iron Crest members as claimants and a fabricated 1987 transfer as the legal hook. I have the filing. It's Exhibit 30. The arson is Exhibit 31 pending the fire marshal's official report. which I am going to request in writing tomorrow morning." Elias Rentham was quiet for a moment. She heard him set something down on a desk. "The arson crosses the threshold," he said. "It crosses the threshold," she confirmed. "I need you to authorize Phase 2 and move the timeline up. They are escalating faster than the original projection. If we wait for the original window, they will do something to a neighbor." She thought of Nadine Carmody in her blue jacket and the way the elderly woman had sat at her kitchen table and spoken in that quiet, steady voice about families who had lost everything. "We cannot wait for the original window." Another pause. She heard the sound of a pen. "Phase 2 is authorized," Elias Rentham said. "I'll make the call tonight." She hung up and immediately dialed Agent Simone Ibarra. Simone picked up before the first ring had finished, which meant she had been waiting. "I heard the fire department call on the scanner," Simone said, skipping every preamble. "Phase 2 is authorized," Isla told her. "Rentham just signed off. I need you moving assets into Harlow County tonight. All of them, quietly." "Already pulling the map," Simone said. Isla Carmody ended the call and walked back outside. The night had come fully down over Harlow County, and the last embers of the barn still pulsed faint orange in the darkness, breathing slowly like something that did not yet know it was finished. She stood at the fence line with her arms at her sides and her face tipped slightly upward toward the night sky, and she looked at what remained of her grandfather's work, and she spoke quietly into the dark. To no one, to all of them, to the men who had done this and believed it made them powerful. You just made it federal. The Harlow County Courthouse sat at the center of town like something that had never once doubted itself. 3 stories of pale limestone, American flag catching the late morning breeze, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small before they even reached the steps. The sun was straight overhead, pouring through every skylight in the main hall, flooding the corridor in clean, unforgiving white light that left nowhere to hide and no shadow to stand in. Isla Carmody had chosen to arrive exactly 9 minutes before the hearing began. Not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to seem unprepared. 9 minutes measured to the second, because every detail today was a choice, and she had not driven to this courthouse to leave a single thing to chance. She wore a navy jacket over an orange top and dark slacks, her natural hair pinned back with quiet precision. She carried a leather document case in her left hand and nothing else. No extra folders to fumble, no visible nerves to read. She walked through the main hall under the overhead fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency she had learned to find almost meditative over 12 years of federal work, and she pushed open the door to Courtroom B without slowing her stride. They were already there. Jett Warwick sat at the petitioner's table in a collared shirt that looked freshly pressed, which told Isla something about how confident he felt walking into this room. Beside him sat the county lawyer, a soft-faced man named Burrell Hatch, who had filed fraudulent land claims on behalf of Iron Crest affiliates in 3 of the 4 prior cases Isla had documented. Hatch had a thick manila folder open in front of him and the comfortable posture of a man who had won this particular game before. Behind them, seated in the first gallery row, were 3 men Isla recognized from her files as Iron Crest members, all clean-shaved this morning, all present as Warwick's claimed witnesses. And there, 2 rows further back in the gallery, sat Sheriff Warren Stills in his green shirt and blue jacket, arms folded across his chest, with the barely contained satisfaction of a man who had already decided how this would end. Jett Warwick looked at Isla when she entered. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the porch, on the day he brought 12 bikes to her fence line and held out a folded check without making eye contact. The same flat contempt, the same assumption of outcome. He looked, and then he looked away, which was itself a kind of dismissal, and Isla sat down at the respondent's table and opened her document case without acknowledging him at all. The bailiff called the room to order. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Celia Farr walked in. Isla had researched Judge Farr with the same thoroughness she applied to every other element of this case. 63 years old, appointed to the county bench 11 years ago after 20 years in federal civil litigation, published 3 articles on property law and due process. She wore black robes and rectangular glasses and moved with the economy of motion belonging to people who have spent decades being the most precise person in any given room. She settled at the bench, reviewed the case number, and nodded to the petitioner's table. Burrell Hatch rose and began. He presented the fraudulent title claim with the specific kind of confidence that comes from having done something enough times that it no longer feels like fraud and simply feels like procedure. He cited 2 documents, both fabricated, both introduced through a falsified county deed record that Rafe Dunmore had arranged through a clerk Isla already had identified in her evidence file. He spoke about disputed historical boundaries and prior informal agreements, and a legal concept he called community tenure claim, which was not a recognized legal doctrine in this state or any other, but which he delivered with enough procedural language that it sounded credible to anyone who was not specifically trained to recognize its fraudulence. He cited 2 prior county court decisions, neither of which had involved the Carmody property in any documented history, a fact Isla could prove in 4 separate formats. Hatch finished, sat down, smoothed his folder shut with the small, satisfied gesture of a man who believes he has already won. Judge Farr looked to the respondent's table. Respondent Isla Carmody stood up. She did not clear her throat. She did not adjust her jacket or glance at her notes. She stood up, placed both hands lightly on the table edge, and looked directly at Judge Farr. Your Honor, before I address the substance of the petitioner's claim, I am required to formally establish my standing in this proceeding. Her voice was even and clear, the particular clarity that comes not from performance but from total preparation. My name is Isla Carmody. I am the sole heir and title holder of the property in question, recorded in the Harlow County Deed Registry under certificate number 0047 GRC 1961, and I appear today in dual capacity. She paused for exactly 1 beat. I am a retired special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 12 years of federal service, 3 commendations, including the Director's Award for Excellence in Financial Fraud Investigation. My specialized field was organized crime enterprise and land-based financial fraud. I retired from active field service to pursue the second capacity in which I appear today. Burrell Hatch's pen had stopped moving. I am a licensed federal land rights attorney, admitted to the bar in this state and admitted to practice before the Federal District Court. I hold certification from the United States Land Rights Division, and I appear today with full federal standing. The room had gone completely still. Not the uncomfortable silence of a pause, but the deeper silence of a space recalibrating itself around new information. Isla heard, from the second gallery row, the specific sound of Sheriff Warren Stills shifting his weight in his chair. She reached into her document case. I am placing before the court 3 items. She walked to the judge's bench and set each document down with deliberate care. First, a comprehensive certified title history for the property in question, authenticated by 3 independent title companies and verified by the United States Land Rights Division, which eliminates every factual basis of the petitioner's claim. Second, a federal land fraud evidence package documenting a pattern of fraudulent title filings across 4 counties, in which the documents introduced today by the petitioner are identified as elements of a broader criminal enterprise. Third, a preliminary injunction motion filed simultaneously in Federal District Court this morning at 8:47, which places this property and all related title instruments under federal jurisdiction pending the conclusion of a federal investigation. Judge Celia Farr took the documents. She read. She did not rush. She turned pages with the deliberate attention of someone who reads to understand, rather than to confirm what they already expect. And as she read, something moved across her face that her judicial composure worked hard to contain. It was not surprise exactly. It was the recognition of magnitude, the particular look of someone who understands in real time that what appeared to be a routine county hearing has just become something categorically different. Burrell Hatch rose from his chair. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to the respondent objects." Isla's voice was quiet and absolute. "Federal jurisdiction has been formally invoked. A recess at this stage would constitute a procedural delay in active federal proceedings. The petitioner's counsel is welcome to review the injunction motion, which is now a matter of public federal record, at any time after this hearing concludes." Judge Farr looked from the documents to Isla and then to Burrell Hatch with an expression that communicated, with extraordinary efficiency, that the recess was not going to happen. Hatch sat back down. "The court will note," Judge Farr said, her voice carrying the measured weight of someone choosing each word with full awareness of its legal consequence, "that the federal injunction motion is acknowledged as received and is entered into the record of this proceeding. The petitioner's claim as presented is facially insufficient in light of the certified title documentation provided. The court is further noting for the record that certain documents introduced by the petitioner today appear to warrant independent review by this court's ethics officer." She removed her glasses. She looked at Burrell Hatch for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at the documents. Isla returned to her table. She allowed herself, in that moment of return, to look at Jett Warwick. He had been watching her since she stood up. She had felt it without looking at it, the way you feel weather changing before you see the sky shift. She looked at him now directly and with full attention, and she watched what was happening on his face with the clinical precision of someone who had spent 12 years reading the faces of men the moment they understood their situation had changed. The contempt was still there at the surface, holdover from the posture he had worn into the room. But beneath it something else was moving. Confusion at first, the specific confusion of a man who had prepared for one version of this hearing and received an entirely different one. Then a kind of recalculation, visible in the tightening around his eyes as he ran backward through everything that had happened since that first afternoon at the fence line. The conversations, the questions she had asked that seemed naive, the way she had watched him without flinching, the barn fire, the complaints he had filed through Warren Stills, each one of which she had apparently anticipated and countered before they landed. And then the cold came. It moved across his face slowly, and then all at once, the way cold actually moves, gradual and then total. The first genuine touch of fear she had ever seen on Jett Warwick, and it looked exactly like what it was. A man realizing he had walked into a room that had been built specifically to receive him, that every door he thought he had opened was in fact a door closing behind him. Isla Carmody gathered her documents into her case with the same unhurried precision with which she had removed them. She clicked the case shut. She straightened her navy jacket, and then she looked at Jett Warwick across the width of that courtroom, under the full clean pour of the overhead fluorescent light and the courthouse skylights letting in the noon sun, and she said it in the same quiet, even voice she had used for everything else today. "Your filing just became Exhibit 31. The word spread through the Iron Crest compound, the same way fire spreads through dry grass. Fast, low, and impossible to stop once it had taken hold. By the time Jett Warwick's boots hit the gravel outside the Harlow County Courthouse, 3 phone calls had already been made. By the time he reached his bike, every senior member of the Iron Crest leadership knew what had happened inside that hearing room. Retired FBI special agent, 12 years federal service, licensed federal land rights attorney, 31 exhibits before a single formal filing. The men who had ridden into Harlow County for 3 years, believing they were untouchable, sat in a cinderblock meeting room at the back of the compound and felt, for the first time, the particular cold that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him has never been solid at all. Rafe Dunmore stood at the head of the table in his black leather vest, over a faded orange shirt and dark jeans, both palms flat on the surface, jaw working like he was chewing through something that wouldn't break. He was not a man built for hesitation. Every instinct he owned told him that speed was survival, that the answer to a closing trap was to move before it shut. "We burn the house," he said. "Tonight, we drive her off the property before any federal unit gets positioned in this county. She's one woman. She's got evidence, but she's got no agents on the ground yet, not visibly. And if she doesn't have a property to stand on, she doesn't have a case anchor." Jett Warwick sat at the far end of the table in his leather cut and dark jeans, fingers wrapped around a bottle he hadn't opened. He said nothing for a long moment. The silence in the room was the loudest thing anyone had heard all day. Rafe Dunmore didn't understand what that silence meant. Some of the others did. Jett Warwick had been in federal crosshairs once before. 8 years ago, a racketeering investigation in a neighboring state that fell apart on a procedural technicality by the narrowest of margins. He knew what federal agents looked like when they were watching. He knew the difference between a woman who was scared and a woman who was waiting. He had known something was wrong about Isla Carmody from the first afternoon. The stillness, the questions that seemed too simple, the way her eyes moved across his men like she was filing rather than fearing. 31 exhibits before the first filing meant she had been building this case before she ever set foot on that porch. It meant the FBI had been in Harlow County, in some form, for longer than any of them knew. Burning the house would not scatter the evidence. The evidence was already somewhere they could not reach. "We don't touch her property," Jett Warwick said finally. His voice was flat in a way that usually ended conversations. Rafe Dunmore looked at him across the table with something that had never been in his expression before when he looked at Jett Warwick. Contempt edged with something reckless. "Then what exactly do we do?" Jett Warwick had no answer that Rafe Dunmore would accept. And that absence, that one long silence, was the fracture line everything else would split along. 2 men from the lower ranks of Iron Crest left the compound that evening without telling anyone where they were going. They were not ideologues. They had joined for the protection, the income, the sense of belonging that men without direction often chase into the wrong places. Federal exposure was not part of what they had signed up for. The word RICO had moved through the compound like a diagnosis, and they were not prepared to absorb it. They drove separately to the same place, the parking lot behind the Harlow County hardware store, where Deputy Cole Maddox had stopped for a coffee on his way off shift. Neither man had planned to find him there. Sometimes the decision to change makes its own path. Cole Maddox stood by his personal vehicle in his civilian clothes, an orange t-shirt and dark jeans, his coffee going cold in his hand, as both men approached from different angles and arrived at the same awkward, frightened convergence beside his car. He listened to what they said. He asked 3 questions. He did not write anything down. Then he sat in his car for 11 minutes, engine off, staring at the windshield. The business card was in his wallet. He had been carrying it for 2 weeks. A simple card with the name of Isla Carmody's legal firm and a handwritten number on the back that she had pressed into his hand as he was walking away from the vandalism report, with his eyes already pointed at the ground. He had told himself he would throw it away. He had told himself that every morning since. Cole Maddox pulled out the card, looked at the number, and dialed. Agent Simone Ibarra answered on the second ring. They met off-road, on a county access path that cut between 2 fallow fields on the north side of Harlow. The afternoon sun sat directly overhead, no clouds, light pressing down on the flat land with the full weight of a clear July sky. Agent Simone Ibarra's vehicle was already parked when Cole Maddox arrived. She stood outside it in a sharp navy jacket over a green blouse and dark slacks, arms loose at her sides, nothing in her posture that was either threatening or forgiving. Cole Maddox got out of his car and stood 10 feet from her and looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in 18 months, which was exactly what he was. Agent Simone Ibarra let the silence run for 3 seconds. Then she laid it out with the clean precision of someone who had done this before and had no patience for ambiguity. She told him what cooperation would mean. A formal immunity agreement for the suppressed complaints, witness protection classification if needed, his name attached to the prosecution as a cooperating law enforcement witness rather than a subject. She told him what silence would cost, his badge, his pension, his freedom, and, she said this last part quietly, without drama, his ability to look at himself in any reflective surface for the rest of his life. Cole Maddox nodded once while she was still speaking, which told her he had already made the decision before he picked up the phone. "The 3 complaints I buried," he said. "Pruitt family, twice. Dative family, once. I wrote them as unfounded. They weren't unfounded." He paused. Sheriff Stills reviewed all 3. "He told me they were a waste of department resources. Those are his words. I can say that under oath." Agent Simone Ibarra took out a small recording device and set it on the hood of her vehicle, oriented toward him, in full plain sight. Cole Maddox looked at it, exhaled once, and started from the beginning. Rafe Dunmore did not wait for Jett Warwick's permission. He had never been a man who waited long for anything, and the courthouse revelation had cut through whatever thin restraint he operated with. In his mind, Jett Warwick's hesitation was weakness. In his mind, the FBI card Isla Carmody had played was a bluff that only a coward would fold to. He drove to Nadine Carmody's house in the middle of the afternoon in his black leather vest over his orange shirt, alone, which was the kind of decision that only a man who had never considered consequences would make. Nadine Carmody answered the door in her blue jacket over a pale yellow blouse and dark slacks, the way she always answered her door, with dignity and no sign of apology for existing. She was 72 years old and had lived on this road for 46 of those years, and she had outlasted every threat this county had ever produced. She looked at Rafe Dunmore on her porch with the unhurried assessment of a woman who had seen his type before, in different jackets, carrying different grievances, all arriving at the same basic errand. Rafe Dunmore said things that will not be repeated here in their full form because some words carry damage even in the retelling. He told her what would happen to her home. He told her what would happen to her. He told her what had already happened to people who kept company with women like Isla Carmody. Nadine Carmody did not back away from the door. She held the frame and looked at him until he was finished. Then she closed the door. She made it to her kitchen chair before her heart began to do what a heart does when a body has absorbed one lifetime of threats too many. She reached the phone. She dialed. And then the kitchen floor came up to meet her. The hospital corridor ran under overhead fluorescent lights that gave everything a flat, honest brightness. No shadows to hide in, no softness to ease the sharpness of the space. Isla Carmody walked it in her orange top and dark jeans, coat folded over her arm, and pushed through the door of Nadine Carmody's room without slowing. Nadine Carmody was awake. Her color was wrong, and her breathing was too careful, but her eyes were clear, and when she saw Isla Carmody cross the room, she reached out one hand without saying anything. Isla Carmody sat in the chair beside the bed and took that hand in both of hers and held it under the white fluorescent light. Neither woman spoke for a full minute. There was nothing to say that the held hands didn't already cover. When Isla Carmody finally looked up, something had settled in her face that was different from every expression she had worn in the past 3 weeks. The operational composure was still there, but behind it, something older and more ungovernable had moved into the foreground. She thought about the Pruitt family's 40 acres. She thought about the Dade family's son, beaten off his own inheritance. She thought about the Holloways who packed up and drove to a city and never looked back at what they'd had to leave. She thought about every name in that folder in the false floor of her grandfather's back bedroom. She had been working for them systematically, in the way a federal case demands, methodically, legally, with restraint. Rafe Dunmore had just reminded her that they were not case numbers. They were Nadine. They were Gerald. They were every quiet life that had been quietly devastated while the county looked the other direction. She squeezed Nadine Carmody's hand once, carefully, and stood. She stepped into the corridor, raised her phone, and dialed. Agent Simona Barra picked up before the second ring. Isla Carmody's voice was low and completely level, the way bedrock is level, not because nothing has happened to it, but because everything has, and it is still standing. "Move everyone in," she said. "Tonight, the sky over Harlow County does not go from dark to light all at once. It earns it. There is a moment, maybe 4 minutes long, maybe less, when the black fades to deep blue and the horizon holds a thin thread of copper along the tree line, and in that window everything is perfectly still. Birds have not started yet. Engines have not started yet. The world is a held breath." Isla Carmody stood on the porch steps of Gerald Carmody's farmhouse in that exact 4 minutes and watched the copper thread thicken. She was wearing her orange top, her navy jacket buttoned to the second button, and dark jeans with her boots already laced. She had been dressed since 3 in the morning, not because she was anxious, because she had waited 3 years for this particular morning, and she was not going to sleep through a single second of it. Her phone sat in her jacket pocket, silent. She had told Agent Simona Barra not to call unless something went wrong, and Simona Barra had told her nothing was going to go wrong, and Isla had said that she knew, but call her anyway if it did. It was now 4:47, and the phone had not rung. Out on the county highway, roughly a quarter-mile east, 3 unmarked black SUVs sat parked at staggered intervals along the shoulder. A white communications van was positioned behind a grove of cedar trees with its satellite array raised. Isla could not see any of it from the porch, but she knew exactly where each vehicle was because she had approved the positioning herself. Simone had asked her 2 nights ago whether she wanted to be in the field unit for the operation, and Isla had said no. She had thought about it for less than half a second before saying no. Her place was here, on this land. She set her coffee mug on the porch railing, the same mug, the same steps where Jett Warwick had held out that folded check and told her people like her didn't own property here. She looked at the fence post nearest the driveway. The wood was weathered gray and ordinary in every visible way. It held a federal recording device that had captured, among other things, Jett Warwick's voice referencing the Pruitts and the Holloways by name in a context that placed him at the center of 2 prior land intimidation incidents. The copper thread on the horizon broke open into gold. At 5:03, Agent Simone Ibarra's voice came through the small radio unit Isla had clipped to the inside of her jacket lapel. Simone's voice was level and technical and carried the specific texture of a woman who had run field operations before and trusted her preparation. "All units confirm. We are go. Dunmore location. Move now." The Iron Crest compound was a converted equipment yard 4 miles northwest of Harlow's center. Chain-link fence, a row of bike bays, a cinder block office building with a corrugated roof that caught the morning light like hammered tin. Rafe Dunmore had been sleeping inside when the 2 FBI tactical agents came through the side entrance. They were both large men in full gear, tactical vests over dark shirts, moving with the compact, deliberate speed of people who trained for exactly this. Rafe Dunmore, who had spent his adult life being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, came out of his cot swinging and was subdued in under 40 seconds. He hit the concrete floor of the compound yard with his wrists cuffed behind him and his face pointed at the sky, already turning pink with the first full light of morning. He said several things loudly. None of them were useful to him anymore. Isla heard Simone's voice again. Dunmore secure. She exhaled once through her nose. 3 miles south, at a wood-frame house on a gravel road outside the county's eastern border, 2 agents in unmarked jackets walked up the front porch steps at 5:07 and knocked on the door with the unhurried authority of people who knew the door would open. Jett Warwick opened it. He was wearing his leather vest over a dark undershirt and jeans, like he had dressed in a hurry or had not fully undressed at all, like some part of him had been waiting too. His hair was uneven on one side. His jaw was set in the particular way Isla had first catalogued from her own porch steps. The jaw of a man who expected the world to yield around him. The agent in front raised federal credentials and said Jett Warwick's full name and the charges. Jett Warwick looked at the credentials. He looked past the agents at the 2 additional vehicles parked on his gravel road. He looked at the sky, which was now fully light and blue and enormous over Harlow County. And then he said nothing. He put his hands forward without being asked. And he said absolutely nothing. Not a denial, not a threat, not a single word of the casual contempt he had delivered like pocket change for as long as anyone in 4 counties could remember. The silence was the loudest thing he had ever done. Isla heard Simone's voice. Warwick, secure. She picked up her coffee mug and took one slow sip. At the Harlow County Sheriff's Department, the morning shift had just started. Sheriff Warren Stills arrived at 7:15, as he always did, in his green shirt and blue jacket, his keyring jangling, nodding at the dispatcher the way a man nods at furniture. He was at his desk when the federal agents came through the front office. He looked up. He looked at the credentials. He looked at the agents' faces, and then at his own desk, at his own hands resting on the blotter. And in that moment, something went out of his expression. Not guilt, because men like Warren Stills had spent decades replacing guilt with bureaucratic numbness, but rather the specific deflation of a man who has finally run out of the particular kind of institutional cover that had always protected him before. He was escorted to a federal processing unit 3 towns over, where the overhead fluorescent lights were bright and white and gave no shadows to stand in. His green shirt and blue jacket looked like a costume in that light, like something a man wore when he was playing a part that no one was buying anymore. The county deed office opened at 8. The clerk, a thin woman named Derry Foss, who had falsified transfer documents on 6 separate properties over the course of 4 years, always under the same coded authorization that led directly back to Iron Crest, was arrested at her desk at 8:09. She had just logged into her computer. The screen was still showing the county seal when the agents came through the door. She looked at her keyboard for a long moment before she stood up. By 9:15, 14 people were in federal custody across 3 counties. Isla Carmody walked off her porch. She moved through the morning light with the unhurried stride of someone who had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. The air was cool and carried the smell of damp grass, and somewhere behind her the burnt wood ghost of her grandfather's barn, which still stood in its charred frame on the east edge of the property like a wound that was just beginning to heal around the edges. Deputy Cole Maddox was parked on the county road outside the property gate, sitting in his patrol car, with his hands on the steering wheel and the window down. He had given his sworn statements 48 hours ago. He was not under arrest. He was not innocent either, and he understood both of those things with a clarity that was Isla suspected, newer and more uncomfortable than anything he had felt in a long time. He watched her walk past, and he did not say anything and she did not say anything to him. There would be time for that conversation later, in a courthouse, in front of a federal judge. That was where Cole Maddox's story would continue. Agent Simone Ibarra arrived on foot from the east end of the driveway at 9:22, still carrying her radio, still wearing her dark operational jacket over an orange top, her natural hair pulled back under a fitted cap. She walked up beside Isla without ceremony, and the two women stood shoulder to shoulder for a moment, looking at the property in the full morning sun. 14 secured, Simone said. I heard, Isla said. They began walking the fence line together. At the first post, Isla stopped and placed 2 fingers lightly on the weathered wood. This one caught the first offer, she said. The folded check. His exact words. Simone marked it on her field log. At the second post, this one caught the conversation with Rafe Dunmore after the tires. He referenced the county deed office by name. Third post, on the far north corner of the property where the fence ran alongside the gravel road. This one caught the Pruitt reference and the Holloways, both names, his voice, his timeline. Fourth post, at the southeast corner where the property line met the old oak grove that Gerald Carmody had planted in 1968 as a windbreak. This one caught the night he thought he was warning me off. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of recorded federal conspiracy, delivered voluntarily to a woman he thought was afraid. Simone looked at the 4 posts, then at the field logs, then at Isla. 3 years, Simone said. 3 years, Isla said. Her phone rang at 9:51. Elias Rentham's name appeared on the screen. She answered, and he spoke, and she listened, and she did not move. Federal land fraud charges had been filed across 4 counties. The Carmody Properties case was formally entered as the foundational precedent for the consolidated federal complaint. The Pruitt family's 40 acres were in active restoration proceedings. The Holloway title claim had been reopened. The fraudulent Iron Crest deed transfers on record across the region were being unwound one by one, each one falling backward like dominoes in reverse, each one returning something stolen to someone who had never stopped being its rightful owner. Elias Rentham said, Isla, you built something that is going to hold. She thanked him. She ended the call. She was standing in the center of Gerald Carmody's land. The oak trees her grandfather had planted as a young man cast long, clean shadows in the morning sun. The wild flowers along the south fence had come back thick and bright since the bikes stopped rolling over them. The sky above Harlow County was open and blue and enormous and completely, finally, entirely hers. Isla Carmody stood in the full morning light on the soil her grandfather had refused to surrender, closed her eyes, and breathed. 6 weeks. That is all it takes for Harlow County to remember how to breathe. Not 6 months, not 6 years, 6 weeks of federal indictments, court filings, and the particular silence that falls over a place when the men who ran it on fear are no longer free to ride through it. The Iron Crest compound on the county's western edge sits padlocked under federal seal. The deed office has a new interim clerk and 2 federal auditors working through its records floor by floor. And on the stretch of rural road that runs past Gerald Carmody's property, there are no motorcycle engines idling in the morning air. There is something else instead. There are trucks. Isla Carmody stands on the porch steps in her olive green blouse and dark jeans, a coffee mug warming both palms, and watches 3 pickup trucks roll down the gravel drive in the early morning sun. The sky above Harlow County is wide and cloudless, pouring clean white light across every field and fence line, and she watches the trucks park in the flattened grass near the burned barn's foundation, and watches the doors open, and watches the people climb out, and she has to take one long, slow sip of coffee before she trusts herself to speak. The Pruitt family arrives first. Marcus Pruitt, broad-shouldered and quiet, lifts a toolbox from his truck bed without ceremony like a man reporting to work he has been waiting years to do. His teenage son follows with lumber balanced across both arms, walking carefully, the way young men walk when they are carrying something they understand matters. Behind them comes a woman Isla recognizes from a photograph in her case file, Delia Pruitt, who stood on courthouse steps in 2019 and watched a fraudulent transfer deed be stamped legitimate and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to. Delia Pruitt catches Isla Carmody's eye across the yard and nods once. Slow and deliberate. A nod that carries everything a sentence cannot hold. The Holloway son drives in behind them. His name is Curtis Holloway, and he drove 11 hours from Atlanta because Agent Simona Barra called his mother and told her what had happened, and his mother called him, and he got in his car at 4 in the morning without fully deciding to. He is 29 years old and has not stood on Harlow County soil since he was 14, the year his family was run off their inheritance. He stands beside his truck for a moment in the morning light, looking at the land the way people look at things they had given up grieving, and then he picks up a hammer and walks toward the barn foundation without waiting for an introduction. Isla Carmody walks down the porch steps to meet them, and in the lawn chair positioned at the precise angle that commands the best view of all activity, close enough to supervise, far enough to be comfortable, sits Nadine Carmody, 72 years old, recovered and radiant, in her blue jacket buttoned against the morning cool. She has a thermos of her own coffee, a look of complete satisfaction on her face, and she is already telling Marcus Pruitt's son that he is holding his end of that lumber wrong. The boy adjusts without argument. Nobody argues with Nadine Carmody, and everyone within 3 minutes of meeting her understands why. The rebuilding begins. Isla Carmody works alongside them, measuring, lifting, steadying beams in the overhead sun that turns the whole worksite gold. Her hands find the rhythm of the work easily. There is a particular satisfaction in physical building after months of legal architecture, in nails driven into wood after years of evidence driven into case files. The barn rises slowly through the morning in the clean Harlow County light, and around it rises something else. The sound of people working together, without fear, talking across the lumber, laughing at Nadine Carmody's running commentary, eating sandwiches at noon in the grass like the land belongs to them, because it does. 2 properties have already had their titles formally restored by federal order. The Pruitt family's 40 acres, fraudulently transferred under Iron Crest coercion in 2020, are once again recorded in Marcus Pruitt's name at the county deed office, stamped and certified, and placed in a folder he keeps in his truck because he is not yet ready to leave it at home. 2 more cases are in active federal review. Elias Rentham's office is moving through the Iron Crest land fraud network with the systematic patience of people who have everything they need and know it. Jett Warwick and Rafe Dunmore are in federal custody, awaiting trial on charges that include RICO conspiracy, arson, land fraud across 4 counties, and aggravated assault. Jett Warwick's attorney filed a motion to suppress the fence post recordings, arguing the placement of recording devices on private property without the subject's consent. Judge Celia Farr denied the motion in 2 sentences. Isla Carmody read that ruling 3 times in one sitting, and each time the second sentence landed like a door closing on something that had been open far too long. In the middle of the afternoon, when the frame of the new barn stands complete against the blue sky and the work crew takes a break in the shade, Isla Carmody walks the property alone. She takes the same path she walked in Chapter 2 of this story, the full perimeter of Gerald Carmody's land, from the north fence line down along the creek bed, across the back field, and up along the eastern edge where the fence posts stand in their long row. She walks it slowly, the way you walk a place you are learning to receive rather than defend. The grass is warm under the afternoon sun. A hawk circles once above the back field and moves on. The creek sounds the same as it always has, indifferent and continuous. the oldest sound on the property. She stops at the fence post nearest the road, the post where Jett Warwick stood 6 weeks ago, leaning on it with the casual weight of a man who believed the earth rearranged itself for his comfort. The post where he crushed Isla Carmody's wildflowers without looking down, without caring what grew there, without for a single moment considering that what grew there was not his to crush. The wildflowers have grown back, not all the way, not fully, but they are there, low and bright, pushing through the grass at the base of the post, in yellow and white, and a particular stubborn purple that seems to belong specifically to this piece of ground. Isla Carmody crouches down and looks at them for a long time. She does not touch them. She just looks. Then she reaches into the breast pocket of her jacket and takes out a letter. Gerald Carmody wrote it 2 months before he died, in the careful handwriting of a man who had taught himself to read and write in his 30s because no one had bothered to teach him properly before then. The paper is worn at the folds from being opened and closed and opened again. She reads it the way she always reads it, slowly, hearing his voice behind every line. He writes, "I always knew you would come back to this land, not because you had to, because you would understand what it was waiting for. This land has been waiting a long time, Isla, not for someone to fight for it. It has fought for itself every season, same as it always has. It has been waiting for someone who understood both what it was worth and what it meant. Those are 2 different things. Most people only ever learn one." She folds the letter. She stands up. She looks out across the property. Every fence post, every field, every acre her grandfather acquired in 1961, against every pressure designed to make it impossible. Every acre he farmed and grieved over and refused to surrender. Every acre she came back to, not as a grieving granddaughter, but as the woman he somehow always knew she would become. She never sold. She never ran. She was never the prey. She was always the trap. The sound of hammers and laughter carries across the field from where the community is finishing what they started together, and Nadine Carmody's voice rises above it all, with instructions nobody asked for and everybody needed. And Curtis Holloway is laughing at something Marcus Pruitt's son said. And the wild flowers at the base of the fence post lean slightly in the afternoon wind. Isla Carmody walks back across the field in the full afternoon sun, back to the porch steps, and picks up her coffee mug. She stands there, olive green blouse, dark jeans, mug in hand, in exactly the place where the story began, and watches the community rebuild what was always meant to stand. She takes a slow sip, and she lets the land be what her grandfather always said it was, home. And 5. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.